part is what's really new about what has come to be known as community rights. And that part sort of looks ahead. And it involves things that most of us never deal with as part of the regulatory system. And that is, you take the 5 or 7 or 9 or 10 things that corporations will always claim after you've said, no CAFOs here, or no frac sand mining here. They're going to say the same 5 or 10 things all the time. And these are going to be claims to various powers and protections that corporations didn't have when this country started out and have gradually gotten. But what you do is you make a list of those claims, and I'll be talking about some of them later. Make a list of those claims and you say, and by the way, part of the law we're passing isn't just no CAFOs or no frac sand mining or whatever. It's to say, around these parts, these protections do not apply and are not recognized here because they interfere with the ability of our local community to exercise its democratic rights to protect itself. Okay, so that's the 3-part brief summary of community rights. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this is I'm going to intertwine some of my personal history with the history of what's now become known as community rights. And probably after I get done with that, we'll take a short break. And then I'm going to summarize some characteristics of community rights that I would have already mentioned and conclude. And then we can open it to questions. That's my plan. So I'm a corporate anthropologist and an activist. I became an anthropologist, a corporate anthropologist, because we fought this particular strip mining and power plant thing for many years. At all these levels I told you about, part of it was also a referendum where the anti-people defeated a referendum for almost $600 million while being outspent 9-1. And without the support of all the usual suspects like Sierra Club and other environmental progressive groups because of complicated political trade-offs which had already occurred. And we were really happy when we won that 60-40 and beat them so bad that they never even thought of doing that again, though they did other bad things. After this whole process, since I was the one who kept going to all the utility meetings and digging through their files, I ended up writing a 900-some page dissertation on how this utility company got away with anything they wanted up and down through a dozen or a dozen and a half regulatory agencies. The utility company was essentially my tribe, and I was using the methods of anthropology that most of you maybe identify with studying some group on an island someplace, or poor people somewhere, or peasants. I used those methods to study this very powerful utility made up mostly of white guys. And that's how I became a corporate anthropologist. I have to say, I didn't make that up. That wasn't original with me. Laura Nader, yes, Ralph's sister, in California at the UCLA Department of Anthropology had been doing it for a long time and having her students studying what she did, what she called studying up, at power instead of away from power. Instead of having an anthropologist come in and study these poor powerless people who were afraid to talk to them and afraid not to talk to them, she had her anthropology students actually study things like dental associations, realtors associations, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and so on. So I don't claim that I made that up, but I was really inspired by the work that she did. So that's how I became a corporate anthropologist. After that, though I was proud of my dissertation, and it was more readable than most dissertations go, and I've had like normal people read it and tell me that, it wasn't what I wanted in terms of a handbook. And by then I had learned so much that I thought, you know, if people knew at the beginning of these campaigns what I know now, they would move along a lot quicker. So I ended up, I was going to write a pamphlet. Don't ever say that. It's with several of my books. I started with a pamphlet. Ended up writing this book, Not My Backyard, the Handbook. So I want you to know, first of all, I still think it's an excellent handbook for regular organizing. It's written totally within conventional activism and regulatory agency stuff, although there are some parts that I think would still be useful. I went on a book tour, did hundreds of interviews on the radio. I was basically promoting the epitome of conventional activism. And I kept meeting people whose stories were nearly identical. All over, because when I went to a place, or I went to a bookstore, or I did a radio interview, before and after they would have me meeting with all these local groups, and I was hearing the same thing over and over again. Oh my gosh, I opened the newspaper this morning and they're going to put a toxic waste dump across the street from the school. What should I do? And so I was on a radio show once, and a lady called in and said something very much like that, and the announcer said, well, here's Dr. Jane Ann Morris, author of Not in My Backyard, the Handbook, and she's going to tell you exactly what to do. And I thought, wow, how did I get myself into this position? And I also started feeling dishonest about, you know, relating to people and implying to them that even if you did everything in this and read every word, that you had a very good chance of succeeding. So I'm still proud of many aspects of the book, but at that time I was starting to really feel bad in certain ways. It has chapters addressing things that will be useful in any battle. What do you do when they intimidate you? How do you negotiate when it comes to that? What do you say to the jobs versus environment thing? How do you organize your group? And so on and so forth. But many aspects of it, again, are strictly oriented toward dealing with the regulatory agencies. But still, and I'm using these books as milestones to show you different phases of my life. It did retain some aspects of what I think is still important, which is the attitude toward democracy. I'm going to read you a brief quote. NIMBY activism is not an obstruction, but a stimulus to finding lasting solutions instead of temporary and often devastating techno-fixes. The real issue behind all NIMBY controversies is the desire to have a world where no one has to be a NIMBY activist. And your backyard is as good a place to start as anywhere. So I feel definitely ambivalent about this, but I'm still kind of proud of the impetus that led to it. Okay, but at just about that time, when I was starting to think, what am I saying to people? You know, things are much worse than I thought. And my heart really isn't in promoting this book as the answer. Even though it will put you at a considerable advantage, the odds are still against you. So at that point, I ran into this crew of people who have the world's worst acronym, POCLAD, the Program on Corporations Law and Democracy. I met up with them in 1995. They had started in 93, two co-founders. And they had added one person since, Peter Kellman, who's a labor activist and environmental activist and a wonderful person. And I ended up becoming the fourth member. Now these people had gotten together for exactly the reason that I was feeling bad about my first book. And that was, they had worked with different groups around the country who had done everything right, worked real hard, crossed their I's and dotted their T's, or whatever the expression is, really read the regs, really been conscientious, and basically they were either making no progress or they weren't beginning to make enough progress to get where we need to go to get ourselves out of the situation that we're increasingly in. So they started saying, okay, let's sort of admit to ourselves that what we've been doing, which is basically regulatory agency activism, has failed. Question was, what else is there? And they didn't know at first, but they had a start by the time I got there. And they were reading in the history of corporations in a state. I know this sounds really interesting, but it can be fascinating. The history of corporate law, which ends up also being the history of constitutional law. None of them started out as lawyers, but we'd already lost ourselves in regulatory agencies. You want tedious, you can go there. I'm sure you've seen that, okay? So we went into this other area and started doing research. Out of that research came all kinds of things, one of which was a weekend-long workshop of which there were done scores, I don't know the final number. They were called Rethinking the Corporation, Rethinking Democracy. And they would start Friday night and go to like Sunday afternoon. We did this all around the country, from people from different states, sometimes just a random collection of people, often increasingly groups that had, or a couple groups together that had similar interests. And they developed and took on different aspects as we learned more what things seemed to work to put into these rethinking sessions, as it were. And those Rethinking the Corporation sessions were the origin of what later became Democracy School. In fact, there's an awful lot of similarities, including Democracy Schools using materials that were put out by POCLAD. And it also led to the workshops that Paul Cienfuegos is doing, as he went regularly to many of his early sessions, and that's where I met Paul. And I met Tom Lindsay, whom some of you may know of, when he was a law student, and POCLAD was lobbying him heavily to try and get him to do some of this, and interestingly, he didn't at that time. And it took him, this is not a criticism, to his credit, he went out and he tried regulatory law until it hit him in the face. And at that time, began working with POCLAD and others to find some alternatives to it. So around 2000, whenever, POCLAD finally put a lot of its writings into a book. And it's this book, and I only have a couple copies. But it's a real good place if you want hard copy, a lot of essays in one place about the origins of what's now community rights and the issues that came up and the research that was done and the discoveries that were made. I guess I have to read something from Colonized, since Bob made a big deal of it, but the first essay in it is, "Help, I've been colonized and I can't get up," and subtitled, "Take a lawyer and an expert to a hearing and call me in a decade." Okay. Interestingly, I wrote this because Earth First Journal, I had a friend on the editorial board of Earth First Journal, and they asked me to write something up. And so I wrote this up, and it's really loose, and it may be the most popular thing I've ever written. But the funny thing is that when I sent it to Earth First, they couldn't deal with it. And they, in fact, didn't publish the most important parts of it. They published excerpts, which are meaningless. And, but I have to thank them for asking me, since I was just very loose and didn't feel like I had to tiptoe around writing them. I was wrong, but it was good for my writing, apparently. So one of the points from Colonize is that in conventional activism, corporations leverage their power, and we activists dilute our power. Corporate strategy leverages their power. Their efforts reinforce and magnify each other. Our strategy splits our resources and dissipates our power. What do I mean here? When a corporation goes to court and gets the right to due process, that works for all corporations, even if one dinky little corporation got it here. If that becomes the law of the land, recognized, then all corporations go, yay, now we got that too. On the other hand, what are we doing? We are organizing ourselves by issue, by geographical location, by type of facility, pipeline versus power plant, by animal, save the wolves, protect the buffalo, or the bison, whatever, by article of clothing, by particular corporation. So even if we agree with each other on all these issues, practically, in terms of the use of our resources, both emotional, time, and financial, we're splitting ourselves. So that's the situation we're in, even if we all get along great, which of course we don't always. So how have we been colonized? Let me count the ways. And think of regulatory activism. We interpret failures as signals to do the same things over again. We are predictable. Our strategies and styles of organizing fracture and dilute our resources. We either accept this dilution as inevitable or blame each other for not organizing right. We censor ourselves in thought and action. We act as though if we describe the problem to each other enough, it might go away. And now we can argue about whether we've been colonized or not. Corporate management is popping extra popcorn for this one. So that just gives you a taste of what's in that essay, Colonized. But basically, what corporations do is they really want us in the regulatory agencies because we are told exactly what to do every second. This is what we can talk about for this long, in this way, at this place, and only that, and forget what we wanted to talk about. And secondly, corporations use various constitutional protections so that they do have more power than people. And undoing these two things is the essence of community rights. So now I want to talk about some of the basic concepts of what I think is involved in community rights and sort of how I came to understand them and how they came to be from what I could see. This is kind of like not a historical approach per se, but me sitting back and thinking, okay, there's so many people working on community rights, and if I isolated each of them in a room and said, okay, what's community rights? And then made a list of everything they said, the overlap would not be precise, if you know what I mean. I would get a lot of different views. So this is an effort for me to like put together a list of characteristics that I think sort of characterize what you have to feel comfortable with or believe or understand if you're going to be comfortable with community rights. And you may not all be, that's okay, but I think this clarity helps. So, one of the things is to understand that our current laws and regulations are not enforced, period. The agencies don't have the person power to do it. Every time some giant thing explodes again, you're going to hear as part of the newspaper reports, and the last inspection was 13 years ago or 4 years ago. And even if there was inspection then, they will probably also say, and of course they got 2 weeks notice, and they spiffed everything up and turned off this and turned on that, and when the inspection was over, went back to regular procedures. So number one, our current laws and regulations are not enforced. We have never seen that work. Number two, looking again at those current laws and regulations, even though there are places that sound good, like the examples I gave you in the very beginning, they're full of loopholes when you look at them carefully. So, number one, they haven't been enforced. Number two, what there is full of loopholes and things that aren't dealt with and the special exceptions. You know, the exemption and variance thing, like, oh, we'll just make an exemption for that. Like, what? Okay. Third thing is what I discovered when I was going around with my book, Not in My Backyard. That even with a lot of knowledge, resources, and a tailwind, basically working conventional activism through regulatory agencies is not going to work. It's probably going to waste a lot of years and then fail massively or largely. And a lot of times people after that just say, this is enough, and they sort of drop out. I have said and been quoted on it that what regulatory agencies regulate is citizen action, much more than corporations or whatever entity is trying to carry something out. And I think the only people who really, really believe that regulatory agencies will save us in the end are people who are just reading about them in the newspaper and have never really gotten in there and tried to get them to work on a particular project. So I want to read a quick quote, and this is from an article called Sheep in Wolf's Clothing. I guess I'll take this opportunity to say, I wrote something up which is a topical guide to different aspects, and you can have a copy of this, anyone who wants it. It says, if you're concerned about this, go to this part of my website. And in fact, the article Sheep in Wolf's Clothing is one of the places I would send you to if you have any questions about regulatory agencies. So don't let me forget to pass that out or offer it again. But I just want to read you one thing about this article I wrote on regulatory agencies. And what I have said to people is, I have a 5-page article I wrote on regulatory agencies. If you read this article, and after reading it, you're still fine with the idea of working through regulatory agencies, I will buy you a beverage of your choice. And I have never had anybody take me up on that. I've taken my offer in a long time. And just let me read you one quote from it. It's a lot of stuff, but much of it is history. And part of this is how railroad executives talk to each other. And this is a direct quote, and another page handout I have if you want to read the history of the establishment of regulatory agencies in this country from the late 1880s, like through the 30s and 40s, when most of the precedents were set. But this is the executives of the railroad corporations talking to each other about what they want in a regulatory agency, since they in fact urged the setting up of the first federal regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is about railroads. This is what they want. What is desired, and these are from like presidents of railroads, what is desired is something having a good sound but quite harmless, which will impress the popular mind with the idea that a great deal is going to be done, when in reality, very little is intended to be done. Okay, so you can read more of that ilk if you just click on the sheep article. Anyway, so number 3 is regulatory agencies are not going to get us where we need to go. Something else happened when I first joined this group, HOCLAD, which is that I first met them at one of these rethinking sessions in my state, Wisconsin. And at that time, what they tried to do was find someone in each state to go and do a little research before the weekend-long workshop. So they would have a little info on that state. And as it turns out, I was at loose ends at that time and had just written this book and loved to do research, so I got to be the person. So they just suggested to me, as they had to many others, go to the law library and look up some of these questions. And they were things like the history, and I knew nothing about corporate law or constitutional law or corporate charters or anything. He said, look up the history of corporations in Wisconsin. Plus I was new to Wisconsin, I had just moved there. Okay, so, but I was perfect in some ways. I had an open mind. Law libraries can be intimidating at first, but then good. And by the way, in this book and on my website, there are a couple articles about how to use a law library and how to go in and find out what you need to find out. And they're written for like normal humans, since I'm not a lawyer myself. Anyway, so I went in there to the law library not knowing what to expect. And what happened to me in about the week and a half of research that I did was probably one of the most intense and important weeks and a half in my like intellectual or emotional development about how I saw the world. Because I went right back to the books, I went to the state law library, where the first laws in Wisconsin as a state creating corporations were passed. And I opened the pages and saw the very pages where the legislator created a corporation, like often a railroad corporation. And I saw it right there. You may build a line from here to there. You may have this many people on your board of directors. You may raise this much money. Put the station on the northeast side, not the southwest side, or whatever. Just a detailed charter. And then often, a year or two later, the legislature, again, would take a look at the progress they made and said, you know, we don't like what you're doing, you're not getting enough done, and revoke the charter. Gone. No judicial participation, just your charter's gone, we don't think you're doing good work, we want these other people to do it. And I read this over and over again, examples of charters, the provisions that they had in them, and then how they were altered, revoked, sometimes expanded, and so on. And I'm going to go over some of the provisions in those later, but it really opened my eyes, and what I got out of this was, oh my gosh, governments really do create corporations and invest them with what you might call a chip off the old block of sovereignty. When a corporation is created, some of the power of government is granted unto that entity. And most of it was without, at that point, without any judicial involvement, okay? Legislatures could put almost any limitations on corporations that they wanted. Why? Because corporations weren't regarded as natural persons or persons before the law, legal persons. And they were not regarded as having any rights. They were like the Department of Agriculture. You create the Department of Agriculture, fine. Next year, if you don't like that, maybe you want to change it to a Department of Sustainability. I don't know, but that's what a law is. It's something that can be made and changed. That's one of the neat things about it, why it's separate from a constitution. So I'm going to give you an example of some of the things that you find in early corporate charters, and you find this across the board during this time, which is early to mid to the beginning of late 19th century charters. I haven't read Iowa law, but I'm thinking your dates and problems are probably somewhat similar to what we find in Wisconsin. Okay, so these are typical characteristics of early corporate charters. Some of them. Corporations are required to have a clear purpose. Your job is to mine lead. Your job is to build a railroad from A to B. And it had to be fulfilled, and if it wasn't, it could be revoked. And it could not be exceeded. If they built the line longer, they could be revoked too. Or if instead of just lead mining, they went to lead smelting and they didn't have that in their charter, the charter was revoked. So it's just complete legislative power over that. Now, I should make an aside here and say that I realize that we did not have a perfect democracy in the mid-19th century. That most human beings were nowhere near being able to participate in it, and I'm sure you know all this. But within the context of the relationship between legislatures and the creation of corporations, it was very clear. It's kind of like looking at Athenian democracy. It looks really neat, and in fact, has many features that I think were impressive, except, of course, only a tiny percentage of the population could participate in that either. We could still get lessons from it. So, number one, corporations had to have a clear purpose, must be fulfilled, cannot be exceeded. Number two, the state legislature could revoke the charters for reason or without reason. And there are court cases or that say specifically, or with no reason at all. Why? Because the relationship between the legislature and its created entities was clear. Another one, as a matter of course, corporate officers, directors, or agents could be held criminally liable for violating the law, sometimes doubly or trebly for damages. Okay? Another characteristic, this can get complicated, but let me just say it briefly. One of the common features was that states insisted that cases against that corporation be heard in state and not federal courts. And if you've had experience knowing the difference between state and federal courts, you meant that was going to be much more favorable to the locals. Often they said things like corporations had to have their headquarters and meetings in the state where their principal place of business was located. So no more annual meetings in the Bahamas. Okay, get away from demonstrators and problems and whatnot. Often corporate charters were granted for a specific period of time, 10, 20, 30 years, or 5 years. They could do whatever they want. And after that, they would automatically be looked at for renewal or not. Here's a good one. Corporations were prohibited from owning stock in other corporations. And this also affected subsidiaries and hiding money where this part of the corporation has the power and this other subsidiary has all the money. So if you sue it, you have to sue the one with the powers, and you can't get at the one which actually has the resources. Okay? Often their real estate holdings were limited to what was appropriate for the project, whether it's a road or a lead mining thing or some other sort of factory. Corporations were prohibited from making any political contributions, direct or indirect.
Oh, yeah.
And this one, I'm going to read you a quote from because it's so important now. Here it is. This was in Wisconsin law in 1905. And when people talk to me about move to amend or moves to repeal Citizens United, which is a separate thing, but I think that would be very minor. I read them this law from Wisconsin in 1905 and say, if you really want to address money in politics, think this way. No corporation doing business in this state shall pay or contribute or offer, consent, or agree to pay or contribute, directly or indirectly, any money, property, free service of its officers or employees, or thing of value to any political party, organization, committee, or individual for any political purpose whatsoever, or for the purpose of influencing legislation of any kind, or to promote or defeat the candidacy of any person for nomination, appointment, or election to any political office. You know, that's getting money out of politics. And Wisconsin wasn't the only place with a law like that in the early 20th century. So anyway, I'm going to leave off on that, but I hope I've convinced you that when I say, okay, legislatures really do create corporations and have power over them, that there's plenty of examples like that. Oh, but some of my favorite examples. They really told them what to do, including what rates to charge in many cases, because they created them ostensibly for a public purpose. If they thought lead mining needed to be done, which they did in southeast Wisconsin, they created a corporation with the rights and powers to do that. If they, so you might disagree with the legislature's call on what the public good is, but that's the purpose for which they were set up. There were many roads, plank roads, that were made Railroads and plank roads being, important aspects of transportation were very common in early charters. And so they would often tell them what they could charge people to use the road, what they could charge people to bring certain animals on the road, and they have this all listed out in the legislature. But one of the features that I found really touching was that they weren't all about dollars and cents, they were about values. Because some of these laws said, if a person is using this road for the purpose of going to town to vote, no charge. Or if a person is using this road for the purpose of going to town to attend a funeral, no charge. Okay, so there were real values sort of within the context of these orders from the legislature. Okay, back to the characteristics. So I would come back and have you think about the regulatory system and tell you that the regulatory system does not work, we know that, but there's a reason for it, and that's because it replaced something that did, which is legislative control by legislatures of the corporations that they created. Okay? The next one's a biggie. I'm going to totally skip over it. We can talk about it later. Because it's the long list of various sorts of powers that corporations end up getting nowadays that they use against people's and citizens' rights to look after their own interests. I put them into 3 categories. First category is rights. You've probably heard of these so-called corporate personhood rights, due process and equal protection from the 14th Amendment, which sort of was a gateway toward Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and seizures. In 1906, a case that prevented the government from seeing the papers of a corporation, and that was invoked again in the 1970s to prevent OSHA from doing an inspection. And now we have various First Amendment rights and so on. So that's one area. I guess I just want to read some of this briefly. No, I'm going to read it later in another part. So I'm organizing corporate protections into 3 groups. The first one was through rights. You can literally say a corporation has a right, constitutional right to, and I give you some examples of that. The second kind of category involves more difficult to explain protections that come out of the Constitution. One comes out of the 1819 Dartmouth case, which basically said that a corporate charter has a special status. Now, the corporate charters I told you about were law. You pass a law, there's a corporate charter. Because you can change your mind about a law, the next year you can repeal the law, repeal the charter, alter it, whatnot. That's what laws are. Well, the Dartmouth case started the practice of recognizing corporate charters, which are passed by the legislature, not as laws, but as contracts. And what does that do for them? That gives them the protection of Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which prohibits the impairing the obligation of contracts. And there were various end arounds on that one, but that one's a real biggie. When a corporate charter, it's not a law like all other laws, it's a contract. So that's one example of protections that are constitutional that don't come from rights. And another example is the kind of thing I wrote about in the book Gaveling Down the Rabble, which is about the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Basically, I've read over hundreds and hundreds of cases and laws, and I was amazed, mostly at states, but also at local power and the kind of laws that have been passed in this country since the 1830s or so, about controlling pipelines, railroads, canals, other transportation, about conserving resources like water or some mineral resources, about prohibiting the import of food or chemicals or other stuff that was regarded as harmful, about requiring labeling, about setting standards for waste dumps, about protecting local economies with laws against certain business practices, about making it possible for states to actually tax corporations from out of state, which has always been hard, or insisting, for example, on safety and labor standards in railroads. And you have no idea the number of these things that were declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. Real green laws in all senses of the word green, mostly between 1870 and 1930. They were just thrown out, and the reason was that they interfered, state laws like this, protecting themselves against things they obviously thought were harmful or not good for them, The claim was that they interfered with interstate commerce. And some of the most wildly creative prose coming out of Supreme Court justices, it's not just me saying that, came from this time. I'm just going to read you a brief quote. And I think you reflect now how this affects us in the way we think about things. In one sense, the story of the decades since the end of the Civil War in the U.S. is the story of how so many people came to believe and accept that they lacked the right to do something as commonsensical as keeping poisons out of their communities. And that, in fact, is the summary of what much of the Commerce Clause jurisprudence by the U.S. Supreme Court has done. So, moving along. Once you recognize that regulatory agency is not so good, that corporations are actually created by legislatures, you get around to the notion that the target of activism is really not the corporation, even though it often looks like the corporation is doing the bad thing. It is rather our government representatives who invested them with that power and are protecting that power to begin with. Okay? I think this point is worth making early and often. Our targets are our government representatives. And I mean target, you know, in a good lobbying kind of like democratic sense here. Because it is the government, even if it's not those particular representatives, it's the government that created the corporation and invested them with power that chip off the old block of sovereignty. And because the government supports the regulatory system, why? Because it shields the government from the people and it shields the corporations from the people, and it works great. And also because corporations themselves are not players, since they are like subsidiary creations of government. Okay, so eventually, getting back to this POCLAD thing, there were a lot of things tried. Some people tried to revoke charters in real time, like in the last 20 years. Pretty tough, but it attracted attention and at least it was educational, and then people realized that revoking charters was a thing, and that hadn't been around in the vernacular for a long time. Some people advocated rewriting the corporate code, which is the state's law governing its corporations, which is massive, but at least it points to the fact that there's a law there that gives them this power. It's not something they're making up. Some people also tried to reverse so-called corporate personhood, starting with some efforts in petitioning as early as 1995, or the Point Arena non-binding resolution, and other things. And Move to Amend is coming off this too, looking for different ways to kind of find the silver bullet, you know, in order to use some of all these new ideas to actually deal with our problems nowadays, which largely concern corporations. So in 2000, that I know of, was the first time something that resembled what's now seen as community rights was talked about. And that was a two-pronged approach. People were saying that, oh, every issue is different. Oh my gosh, every aquifer is different. You know, every power plant is different. Yes, but in many ways, the kind of powers and rights and protections that corporations claim are almost identical in all those cases. So in 2000, the idea was circulated that, okay, maybe we should do it this way. Pass a law, again, that reflects what we want. But number two, have part two of the law be, and by the way, this list of corporate protections and powers is not recognized in this jurisdiction. And I think that was an important step, because that began to be talking about, and soon after that, it began spreading. Now, one of the advantages of that is that corporations have to say what's really going on. They can't just say, oh, we're here because we want to help bring jobs to your community. And, you know, it'll be a beautiful strip mine. You won't believe it, and then they get these lawsuits and all this kind of stuff. When you are talking about a two-pronged law like that, that specifically deprives corporations of this extra juice, these extra protections, corporations have to publicly argue against that. And they have to get up there, either in briefs or in court or in public, and say, of course we have these protections. Of course we have due process rights. Of course we have equal protection rights. And you, citizens, don't have the right to protect your communities. But this has to be public. And this often boomerangs on them, and then it just causes a lot more support to well up from the community when they realize how blatant this is, which is not apparent in a lot of regulatory battles. In 2002, I actually got a group to sort of agree to that. And they were a group that dealt with U.S. American foreign policy, a national group with chapters all over the country. They were trying to change U.S. foreign policy. So the part of the law, the first part of the law, the first prong was, don't do business with these corporations that are acting real bad in this particular foreign country. And the second part of the law was to be, plus we don't recognize these constitutional protections here. And I managed to get at a national meeting of this group, them to pass it unanimously. Everyone liked the idea, we talked about it, and then things settled down, we went back to our own chapters and stuff, and nothing happened. And I brought it up, I said, wait, what about that thing that you passed unanimously, which I thought would be a national effort and all the chapters working on it, and they said, well, do it. And I'm bringing this up because they totally misunderstood what was involved. They thought this was the kind of thing that would fit into a much narrower regulatory conventional activist model where you get a lawyer and they kind of do this paperwork stuff and something happens. Whereas one of my points is that community rights is much broader than that, and without both grassroots support and deep understanding, it won't work. A couple more things and we'll take that long-awaited break. Another characteristic I think you have to get to is getting beyond what Polk always called describing the problem. If you think how much time in your meeting is devoted toward complaining about the problem, whether it's CAFOs or saying the latest bad thing that's happened and so on, it's really a lot of time. With community rights, there's a whole nother level of time wasting on another aspect of describing the problem, which is describing all those darn constitutional protections the corporation has. Now, in both cases, I want to say, if you are talking to people who don't think there's a problem, then you have to describe the problem, whether it's about CAFOs or constitutional rights. On the other hand, if you're among yourselves or people who understand that there's a problem, free yourself of that. Just don't spend any time on that, and instead spend your time on strategizing, working things out, understanding aspects of the problem better, whatever. I can't tell you how much time I see people spending, and it's just sort of a default position to slip back into, let's describe a problem again. It's kind of like a venting, but sometimes it's, in my opinion, not the best use of time. So, in contrast to the regulatory approach, community rights is really different because it's not just seeking one thing, not just seeking one time you can get something past this hearing examiner and maybe get this regulatory agency, which never works for the people, to maybe deny one project. Just trying to get past, you know it's not a fair setting, you know it's not a fair process, but you just want to get this one denied on that basis. That's not what community rights is. Community rights is actually seeking to change the way those decisions are made so they're made more democratically with the contribution and the efforts of all citizens. And so I think it's not just a new tactic like here's a better boycott or a better puppet show and stuff. It's actually at the level of cultural change. And that may reflect the fact that I am, after all, a corporate anthropologist, but it's a big change in mindset. And my final point before we take a little break here is because it's a cultural change and requires the support of a lot of people in the community, not just 3 out of 5 county commissioners or whatever you have, that the goal really has to be to create and nurture a community where people actually believe they have the right to participate in decisions that affect them. And I think in getting to be specialists at the regulatory agency, we have gotten away from that. So, I'll get a drink of water, let's take the brief break, and then I'll summarize and end, and you can do questions and comments. Okay, I realize that there's a teeny thing I want to add to what I said before. When I was talking about corporations, protections from the Constitution, I said there were 3 types, and I only said 2. Did anyone pick up on that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I finally recalled the 2. So the first type is through rights. The second type is through constitutional protections, and the two examples I gave were the contracts clause in the Dartmouth case and corporate charters being called contracts instead of laws. The other example I gave of that came from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution and gambling. Well, the third category of corporate protections, I'm not sure what to call it, but it's sort of a preemption thing or direct limitation on local power. And into this category, I consider things like Dillon's Rule, maybe a particular messed up version of Home Rule, and various other state preemptions, very clear-cut state preemptions of local power. So, sorry about leaving off number 3, that wasn't a joke. So what I want to do now is sort of summarize what I thought I was giving as 12 characteristics of community rights, and I'm going to try to just sort of say them and not start describing them again, and then conclude, and then we can have discussion. So I have this list here, and I can think of like 4 possible reasons that this list might be useful. One is within your group to sort of compare notes, like maybe you're having disagreements, and you thought you agreed, we call this false agreement. We think we're agreeing, and then you say, okay, so let's do A, and everyone says, are you kidding me? I don't want to do A, I thought we were going to do B. And sometimes if you have a list of characteristics, you can kind of go through and say, aha, number 7 is the one that we think differently about. And then rather than just sort of getting more uncomfortable, you can talk about number 7 and figure it out. So within your own group or community, I think it can be useful. Secondly, it might help you pinpoint what you might need to spend more time talking about or doing research on or develop handouts on and so on. Thirdly, it would help you in developing outsider support, because even if you're totally cool within your group and you know everything and don't need more research or handouts, you're going to have to talk to your neighbor, an elected official, someone you do business with, someone outside yourself, and explain this to them. And in fact, when you do so, I hope you keep a list of the questions they ask, because I think you're going to find like certain 5 things come up almost all the time. And those 5 things are going to be the things your group needs to be sure to address, perhaps with handouts. So anyway, in seeking broader public support, whatever direction that goes in, talking to the news media, you want to explain this to a difficult audience, try that. It might help to have this list of characteristics. And finally, at some point you may end up talking to a lawyer. It might be a lawyer connected with a government entity whose job it is to protect the laws that are on the books now, which community rights goes against many, many of those. You might find yourself talking to an attorney because you want one to protect you or to assist you in doing ordinance work or other sorts of things. But you're going to have to be able to explain to the attorney what all's involved in this, and that you in fact understand what's involved in it, and tell that person what you want them to do. And part of that, of course, is going to be referring to the vast amount of work that has already been done on this, but most attorneys don't know about that. So those are the reasons I have for thinking that sort of a list of characteristics or aspects of community rights might be helpful. So I'm going to go fairly quickly here because you've already heard this. Number 1, our current laws and regulations are not enforced. We have never seen that. Number 2, the current laws and regulations, even if they were enforced, are full of all kinds of loopholes and exemptions. Number 3, conventional regulatory agency activism does not work for us. It works for corporations by regulating us more than it regulates them. Number 4, government really does create corporations and grants them some of its power in doing so. Number 5, part of the reason the regulatory system doesn't work is not only that it was set up by people in large corporations with their direct cooperation and assistance, but because it replaced a system that did work, which is more direct legislative control of corporations. Number 6, there's a boatload of constitutional and legal protections that corporations now have. This is those 3 categories. Number 1, through rights. Number 2, things like contracts clause and commerce clause. Number 3, further limitations on local power, such as Dillon's Rule and state preemptions. Number 7, because of all the preceding, your target is really not the corporation itself, even though I know corporations do bad things. Your target is really your government, which has created and continues to support corporations. Number 8, since when confronted by the situations, corporations always fall back on the same defenses, and there's usually a minimum of 5, and I could probably battle off 17. You need a two-pronged approach to address them. Number 1, address your issue in a straightforward way, which we don't get to do in regulatory agencies. Number 2, list those corporate powers and protections that you have decided you no longer accept and interfere with your democratic ability to govern yourself. Number 9, when you do this, the corporations have to argue the real issue, which is not parts per million, but we have more constitutional protections than you, and you locals don't have the powers to do much of anything, which is a real organizing tool. Number 10, you need to get past describing the problem, okay? Which can take various kinds of forms, but it often wastes a lot of time. Number 11, you're trying to accomplish much more than the regulatory agency approach, not just getting one thing done or getting one thing project negated or voided or disapproved. You're really trying for a cultural change which is aimed at local people and communities actually being able to control their destiny. And number 12, when you do this, I think the structure that your group is working with will probably have to be somewhat different from the standard structure of a nonprofit group that was oriented toward regulatory agencies. Because you no longer have a lawyer doing regulatory agency stuff and a couple of experts and then a bunch of people talking about things, leafleting, and raising money to pay the lawyer, okay? You're dealing with a much more deep approach, much more culturally oriented, much more long-term, and I think it's worthwhile considering that, frankly, the structure of your group should reflect those different aims. Okay, now, while all this is going on, I have questions too, and I'm not asking them directly, but there are 2 questions that are in my mind, and I hope that one way or another through our discussion, I'll learn more about them. Number 1, if there are those of you out there who know about community rights, think you have a decent understanding of it, and don't think that it would be right for you or your group to do, I would like to know why, like of these characteristics or something else. What is the difficulty, okay? And number 2, if you know about community rights and think it sounds pretty good and would like to do it and want to do it, what has the obstacle been to your pulling that off? Okay, so those are things that I wonder that will help me in the future a lot. So community rights is an alternative to conventional activism. It's not just like a new little tactic that you can use. I think it's a whole different approach. The corporate side thinks in terms of strategy, and I mean long-term strategy. I mean like 137 steps, okay? Whereas often we don't get beyond, oh, let's do a demo, and then we'll have another meeting. Okay. Why are we doing these things? I'm not against demos or most other actions, but I think it's important to link them to a longer-term strategy. But I want to remind you all that community rights is not at all new. First of all, it's what communities in this country had for decades, before and after independence, okay? And it all deteriorated under a corporate onslaught, of which I gave you the outlines of the sort of deteriorations that occurred. And so if you just think of that as, oh, we lost this, and we lost this, and we lost these 2 things, it looks really depressing and so on, and in fact it can be discouraging. But frankly, that's a map to undoing it, because it's just all laid out there. All the little steps that were taken to reduce our ability to participate as citizens can be undone. In fact, we don't have to take near that long on it, but it's all laid out there. Most of these characteristics were in the Declaration of Independence, one of the important aspects of which is, and by the way, in many state constitutions, either the literal text of the Declaration of Independence or the concepts were stuck in there. Sorry, I don't know about Iowa. But one of the aspects of this is that if in fact power comes from the people, you know, the source of power is the people, and this was different from what they were doing in Europe, whereas the power came down from the sovereign or came down from God, or both, whatever. In this country, power resides in the people, okay? And so the idea is that if power comes from the people, rises up from them, then the state cannot take away a power that it did not grant to begin with, nor can a federal government. So if local power arises out of the power of citizens, it's not for a state to be able to take that away. The most radical discussions of democracy that I have found, guess where that would be? I'm talking about in written materials.
Folk songs.
Oh, that's great. That's great, but not with this kind of detail. Of all things, I never ever would have guessed this in my life, but law review articles. These are things written by law professors. You know, some of the best stuff that I've gotten, you know, all my research has been from there. There's the Carl Mayer 1990 Hastings Law Journal thing where he goes, it's called Personalizing the Impersonal. You can Google it and get it. He goes through all the corporate protections from the Constitution that corporations have gotten historically, and in the end, he gives you an appendix and lists them all. Okay, great. I have with me here a 1936 address by the Dean of Chicago's John Marshall Law School to a bar association, talking about why we should revoke the equal protection and due process provisions that in the late 1880s the Supreme Court granted to corporations. I also have, I'm not going to read it to you unless you beg me, but 1938 and 1949 dissents in two important Supreme Court cases by U.S. Supreme Court justices, not your usual rabble-rousers or, you know, radicals, just ripping apart the decision to consider that corporations were persons. And had anything to do with natural persons, to take this amendment, which was intended to apply to freed slaves, and decide that it was a way to free corporations from being subject to state authority. And the words I just used are almost exactly the words they use there. So the things that used to exist in the United States are things like direct legislative control of corporations without a lot of judicial interference, very few restrictions on local power. You couldn't coin your own money and make war, things like that, but basically few restrictions. No Dillon's rule, no corporate rights, no commerce clause, contracts clause, and other protections. Okay? In addition, this kind of thinking has been out among activists since 1994 that I know of through POCLAD. So it has been percolating around and talked about a lot, and it has been difficult to find a way of like grabbing a hold of it and applying it, but I think that's begun to happen. As you probably already know, over 200 what's become known as community rights ordinances have been passed in the United States. Okay, that's a lot of them. There are other groups working on them or in one phase or another. Most of them have not been messed with. Some have gone as far as judicial appeals. By this time, there are all kinds of sample ordinances out there. You can see how they played out. You can Google them online, see how other groups fared. The ordinances are evolving, both to fit more things we understand and to fit different situations, but it really isn't that new. They have changed over time to match the actual or anticipated corporate response. Now, I haven't talked about ordinances a lot here, and I'll tell you why. Because first of all, if you understand the principles that I outlined here, and you're comfortable with it, doesn't mean you're going to give a lecture in the law school. But if you are comfortable with those characteristics, then an ordinance is not going to be any big deal to you, because each part of all the sample ordinances that are out there addresses a certain aspect or characteristic that I went over. And secondly, if the perfect ordinance for Iowa City or Johnson County just floated down from the sky and fell into all your hands, if you have that ordinance and you don't understand these characteristics I'm talking about, you won't be able to go anywhere with it, because you won't be able to explain it to all the people you're going to need to explain it to and get the kind of community support you need. So, community rights is now spreading in a really diverse way. Some people regard this as a problem. I think it's wonderful, because in evolution, diversity is a good thing. It precedes and accompanies a lot of experimentation and trying a lot of new things. I think that's what we are now, a lot of primates scrambling around, trying to figure out what will work best. And I think that's a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing. So we don't know where it's going to go, but you're part of it, so enjoy it. Thank you.